Good morning. Give everybody a chance to come in and sit down. Remember when you used to go to school and you were late for class, you got detention? Had that a few times. Glad you decided to sit down. Good to have you in class. Open your Bibles, please, to Daniel chapter 3. Cliff is going to lead us in opening prayer. Cliff, please.
Father in heaven, thank you for this day to be able to come together, fellowship and love for each other. Thank you for a lesson that we with Richard to us, and we pray that we take it and apply it to our lives and be a better example to others. We're thankful for Jesus came to this earth and died for us, that we might receive that home in heaven, following after his will. We ask you now to go with us in our lesson. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Oh, I need to say. Okay, so that's out of the way. Happy Mother's Day, Janie. I forgot. So anyhow, well, my mother's gone. I don't think. It's like, okay, come on, kids. All right, so we're in Daniel chapter 3, a very interesting chapter in the book of Daniel. It's a chapter that many, quote, liberal theologians reject. Anybody got an idea why they may reject it? Because Daniel's not in it. Just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is in this chapter. So Daniel was probably away. He's very high up in the government. Daniel might have been on a trip for the king or, somewhere else. But just because he's not mentioned here doesn't mean that this is not a chapter that we need to apply to our lives and belongs in the book. So let me get this turned on. So far, we have discussed, the captivity has started. And of course, you'll remember the four young men, along with other nobles, were taken into captivity. And these four were chosen, especially by God, I believe, to fulfill the task that's to be fulfilled while they're in captivity. We looked at the image that tells us of Babylon, Medo-Persia, the Grecian Empire, and the Roman Empire, and a fifth kingdom. That's very important. That was in chapter 2. And that fifth kingdom is that which you want to circle, in your thinking, because it's talking about the kingdom that we're in today. Now, we're going to look at this golden image today. And what I think what is interesting about this, and I never have any new thoughts. Everybody always has new thoughts on things. But I was thinking, very interesting that Nebuchadnezzar builds an image of gold. Because in the previous chapter, no matter what the time span is there, he was told that he was the head of gold. And so it's kind of an interesting chapter. It causes some problems for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, not really. It just allows us to see what kind of young men they were and the kind of men that we want to be today. And so it's a very interesting chapter. So let's take a look at the first couple of verses here and see what's going. Well, verse 1, you've got a statue that's 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Would that be quite an accomplishment in those days? Can you imagine? And it's gold. So it's interesting. We'll see what goes on here. Let's read a little bit. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Does anybody know how they figured out a cubit in those days? About how long a cubit was? Which would be about how long? 16 to 18 inches, right. So that was a standard of measurement for them. So that's why we have the image as tall as it is. Now, he summoned a lot of officials at this time. In verse 2, then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent a word to assemble the satraps, and they were just protectors of the kingdom, rulers over large divisions of the empires. And then you had the prefects, which were high-ranking officials that were directly responsible to the satraps. I think that's how you pronounce it. And then governors were administrators of districts of smaller groups, and you had counselors that were advisors, and treasurers would have handled what? the money. And judges, they were law bearers, and the magistrates were over chiefs or superintendents. And then he just said all the rulers of the province they would have been the other officials, not specifically mentioned. So what he's done is he's built this image, and he's called all these leaders in. You call all the leaders in, what are they supposed to do with the message? Spread it around, right? And so he calls them all in, and we don't have everything that went on here, but we do have this in this chapter, and I think it's a very interesting chapter. And of course, most of us know the story because it's a story that our children probably know well, right? But again, I'd like to say it's not a children's story. It's the truth written for us to learn, of course, teach our children and teach them what we can from it, but especially for us. It says in verse 3, let's just go on down to verse 4. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear all these instruments here," you'll see in verse 5, that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up, you're to fall down and worship the golden image. That's all they had to do. Right? Does that sound really difficult? Instruments play, just fall down and worship the image and you can go back home, correct? Seems to be no problem, right? We might justify us doing that thing. It's no really big deal. I don't believe in this image or anything, but anyhow. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace, a blazing fire. And I looked at those and everything on in research and stuff, and these furnaces were pretty large, and they could be very, very hot if they chose to do that. Therefore, at the time when all the peoples heard the sounds of the horns and the flutes and lyres and trigons and the psalteries and the bagpipes and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Now, I don't know how all that was accomplished, but what the text is saying is that when these instruments declared it was time to fall down, the people did what? Of every language, of every nation that Babylon would have been over, those people fell down and worshiped, whether they believed in him or not. And why did they fall down and worship? Do you like to be thrown in a blazing fire? Into the furnace. So that was the command. Now, we say we don't do it, but sometimes we justify doing some things we shouldn't do because it's just temporary, or God understands things can be difficult. But we're going into the story now that these young men, they didn't justify not even falling down, did they? And so we'll take a look at this. So it's an interesting story, and I think it should lift us up a little bit and encourage us to be the men we need to be. Now, you've heard me say several times, I think I've been talking to a couple fellows, we need to start raising our young boys to be what? Men. When I was a young man, the feminist movement came along, and some of you weren't even born until after the feminist movement. But if you watched a lot of the TV shows on TV, the comedies and everything, who were they putting down all the time? Men. Men were seen really of no value. They were always talking about how they weren't around and how they were stupid and they were bumbling idiots and everything else. And we're at a point in our culture, men are not very highly what? Respected. As a matter of fact, some men don't even stand up courageously as men anymore. So what we need to start raising is we need to start telling our children it's all right to be a man and it's all right to be a woman because that's who God created you to be. Now, what are your roles as men and women? We see these young men here where they've been young men yet, right? We see them standing up very courageously to this king because they knew as Jews or Israelites that they were not going to be idol worshipers. Now, had their grandfathers and fathers been idol worshipers? Yeah, that's why they're in captivity, basically. But these young men were not going to do that. And there's a cost for standing for truth, isn't there? And we need to be able to do that. And again, it's okay It's okay for a boy to be a boy and a girl to be a girl. Do you understand that? It's okay, because that's what God created us to be. And so just some thoughts as we go down through this. Look at verse, where are we at here? I better, I got to click this thing though, okay. Okay, here's the charge against Daniel's three friends. Now remember, some liberal theologians deny this chapter. It doesn't even belong here because Daniel's not there. Daniel not being there, it really is not our concern. What is our concern is the men that were there, correct? All right? So, for this reason, at the time certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. We call these guys tailors, okay? Now, did these guys like these Jews? No. Why?
They were jealous.
What? Jealous of what?
Because they had more, well, they were closer to the king.
Some had more authority, right, than they did. All right. So they responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, all those things, is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down, and it's like they need to remind the king, right? Whoever does not fall down shall be cast into the midst of the furnace of the blazing fire. In other words, they want to make sure that when they tell the king what they're going to tell him, that he remembers that he needs to cast these men into what? The fiery furnace. There are certain Jews, that's an interesting statement. There are certain Jews, that means there are other Jews that what? There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon. Of course, that could be said it's talking about that also. Namely, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. They weren't concerned about anybody but these three young Jewish men. It seems they weren't even concerned about the other Jews because they didn't say, hey, we got 100 Jews here that refuse to bow down. So here we go. Now, I think Nebuchadnezzar liked these guys because of what he does next. Now, he's furious. I mean, he set out an order and they've what? They ignored it. And he's furious about it. And so he should have just said, cast them into the prisons, into the fire, right? But he doesn't do that. Watch what he does here. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and in anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before him. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, is it true? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When he asked that question, he's giving them a chance to what? Change. Here's the interesting thing about these kings. Normally they wouldn't ask that question. Oh, they haven't done it, cast them into the what? The fire, furnace. Because he doesn't need to quiz them about anything. He's the king. So he says, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you did not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? You think these men were trembling? I don't. I'm sure there'd be a fearful thought about going into the fiery furnace, right? I don't think they were trembling before his power or authority. Matter of fact, as we read down through here, these men were ready to live or die, and they're young men. But he says, is it true? And here's what goes on from, let's see where I'm at here. Okay. Is it true? Verse 14. 15. Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of those instruments, in other words, I'm going to give you a second what? But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can say to deliver you out of my hands? That's an interesting statement there, isn't it? For several reasons. He's giving them another chance. In other words, he's doing something for them that he would not generally do for others. I think Nebuchadnezzar liked these four Hebrew young men. You know, that's my personal opinion. I don't think he wanted to throw them into the fiery furnace, but he had no what? Had no choice. He's the leader. And what the leader says goes. And so, okay, guys, here's what we're going to do. Is this true? Not a word mentioned. He says, here's what we're going to do. When these instruments play again, you're going to bow down and worship the golden image. That's what he's saying. And of course, that's what he's hoping that they'll do. And he says, and what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? And he's going to learn, isn't he? Share.
But he'd already had one encounter with what God did.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
And that, you also wonder if he's not saying, can your God do something for you now?
Yeah, well, yes. Is your God really that powerful, right? So he's still polytheistic, isn't he?
Yeah.
And you'll see that in his reaction. Well, we'll just go on here right now. But anyhow, I think it's just an interesting text. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. Is that belligerent or courageous? Think about it. Great king. I can see him saying, great king, we don't need to answer you on this matter. And it's like, you should already know what we believe. And it's like they're saying then, and we're going to read it down through here, what will be, but we're not falling down and worshiping this golden. I didn't hear you, please.
They're saying God will answer.
Yeah, God's going to answer. And Nebuchadnezzar's going to find that out, isn't he? So it's just really a beautiful story. But I think the greatness in the story is these are young men. They may not even be 20 years old yet. May not be. So they're doing things that we would not expect teenagers to do today. And of course, I know if you're 19, you're not considered a teenager, and stuff like that. But nevertheless, but we wouldn't expect young men to do that because they've got so much ahead of them. They've got their whole future ahead of them. They've got maybe a family. And I don't think these fellows had families, but they may have had families. But nevertheless, they've got so much ahead of them. They just said, great king, we don't need to give you an answer. So the next time you're called into the elder's office, great bishops, better duck, okay? Anyhow, so I just like this here. Listen, then the herald loudly proclaimed, to you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. So it's not just these three men they need to bow, it seems what? Others are going to also, that at the moment you hear the sound of these instruments, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately, you might circle that. There's no more trial. Immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn and all those instruments, nations and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Okay, for this reason, at that time, the Chaldeans came forward and brought the charges against it. I guess we've already talked about this and everything, but they responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar, O king, in verse 10 again, we've got a charge against these men. And Nebuchadnezzar's down here. And I went back on some things, I'm sorry. Verse 15, now if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, and all those instruments, you need to fall down and worship immediately and see what God can save you. And so Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego said, we don't need to give you an answer. Here it is. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hands, O God. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So they're very clear what? We're not going to do this. I'm sorry, my mind went back to something else. I went to some other previous verses. So the king's response is simple. Fall down and worship. Oh, is it true you didn't do that? We don't need to give you an answer. It will be whatever our God wants it to be, correct? I mean, that's what he says, isn't it? And their answer, we've already taken a look at it. It's very, very bold. I think it's bold for young men of their age. Because they knew that when they said no, they were going to what? Die. and not a pleasant death. Yes.
They don't say God will save us. They may not even believe that. They just say he's able to save.
Yeah, they don't.
And we are invisible.
Right. It's like whatever God wants will what?
We walk by
We-
his way whether we understand it or not.
Right. And that's a good point that you brought out, whether we understand it or not. Now, we would generally say today, let's bring our lawyers in and let's try to get out of this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not try to get out of it, did they? They said, we're going to stand for our God no matter the cost. Gene.
I wonder if they had some confidence of this position in light of what happened with Daniel interpreting the dream and these three men not perishing with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So, but still, you're before the king, and your life's being threatened. It's just an interesting paradox.
Do you all get the idea that these four young men were trained well by their fathers before they went into captivity? There was a remnant, faithful remnant, remember, and they're part of it that went into captivity, right? These are young men, and we were saying that they were about 15 when they went into captivity. So you notice very quickly they were trained well. And they received God's word, and they knew where they ought to stand and so forth, and they do it. And there's no excuses here, is there? And if they'd yielded to the king, somebody would have said, well, they're just young. Today, they're just young people. God will understand that. Right? You've heard that said, God knows they're young and they're struggling and so forth. But no, these men stood up. And they walked through it. Anybody else, please? Who said Richard? Okay, Tim.
There's a lesson for me here that they were thrown into the furnace not because they worshiped Jesus and God, but because they would not worship Nebuchadnezzar.
Absolutely.
It's possible for me today to love God and to love Jesus, but also love the world and be far from God.
Yeah. So you would love more then? Yeah.
Yeah, 1 John 2:15 says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him.
Yeah. So there's some real things to learn here, isn't there? Anybody else, please? We'll get through this pretty quick this morning. Oh, okay, go.
They were together. I think they had some time to talk too about what they were going to do. So they predetermined that if something happens, this is where I stand. How about you guys? And there was maybe some courage in that threefold cord as well. But they had already decided if we are persecuted, we're standing.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that out along with Tim's. That's a very important thing to bring out. They'd already decided and gotten together about it. Thank you. Anybody else? The more I think about that, Matt, the more I think that's probably something maybe we lack. Not getting together and say, we'll stand on this together. We'll walk the walk together. Gene.
I was just thinking, you mentioned how young they were. You would think that it would be older, mature Christians that would take that position. I mean, we've seen Moses, Abraham, and this is not what you would anticipate. Personally, I would think a young person would be thinking more about, I have a lot of life here to live.
Yeah.
So it really does show, like you said, how strong their faith was and how well trained they were.
Yeah. So does it show us what they valued the most? They didn't yet have the cross, did they? They didn't yet understand everything like we do, yet they valued serving who? God. And were willing to give their life for it. I don't think they knew for sure whether they'd live or die. Do you? I don't think they knew, but they were ready to do either one. Did he have his hand up? I saw it going like, does he do that when he talks to you all the time? We'll talk to him about that, okay? All right, let's go on and see what we got here. Verses 19 through 23, let's take a look at that. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered. It reminded me of my mother's facial expressions sometimes when she was filled with wrath against me, because I was always doing what she told me not to do. It seemed like every time Mom said, "Now don't do that," it'd be like she said, "Don't touch that paint. It's what would I have to do?" You all don't have that problem, but I have to touch that paint. So a lot of times I would see the expressions change on my mother's face, and I knew, just don't duck, don't do anything, just stand here and take it because it's coming, right? Well, think about Nebuchadnezzar now. He has done something for these guys that he may not have done for anyone else. He has said, "Is it really true? Is it true that you didn't bow down?" And they said, "Great King, we don't need to answer you." Wow. So can you see it's kind of burning inside of him. And he gave them the chance, and they didn't what? So here he is. So was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders. Now this is interesting. Just heating a furnace enough to burn them would be enough, but he wanted to make sure what? 7 times. What's the word 7 mean? To the Hebrew, perfect. It's really, really, really what? Hot. Have you ever built a fire so hot, that as you approach it, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter? You remember the old wooden stoves at home? Well, some of us remember them. The coal stoves that would sit, they'd be really hot up front, wouldn't they? And the closer you got, you could almost burn your hand without touching them. Or the old gravity furnaces where those registers on the floor would be really, really hot. So this thing means that boy, when they hit that fire, they're going to be what? Yeah. Matter of fact, it cost some of his men, didn't it? This is the amazing thing about him. So he commanded certain valiant men, and I think that's interesting. He knew the regular guys wouldn't do it. So he commanded his valiant warriors, his warriors, he commanded them, and that amazes me, who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't think he really needs to tie them up. I think these guys were what? Okay, we're ready. Whatever God decides. And that's the important thing. It's hard for us to remember. And we're going to talk about God can decide to allow us to be persecuted in just a minute. God is allowing this to happen in their lives. I believe God's in control of everything. I really do. And he knew that the things these 3 young men were going to face, well, the 4 young men. And he knew their characters and stuff, and he gave them the strength to face the things that they needed to face. Verse 21, then these men were tied up in their trousers and their coats and their caps and their other clothing. You'd want that on because those would catch fire or what? And they would increase the response, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because of the king's command was urgent, and the furnace had been extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, what do you think about that? What do you think about the insanity of the warriors that put them up there? So it's really hot. Have you ever been in a foundry, where they're making things? So you know how hot things can get. And so it's really hot, and these valiant warriors had to give their lives to watch Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walk into the fire. I think they walked right in. That's me. I don't think they were thrown in. I think they walked on in. But they lost their lives. And we don't hear Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego screaming, no, we changed our mind. No, we'll fall down and worship. There was no excuses. They were just ready to go. I think they were men among men. We have our heroes today, all these heroes today. And everybody can't be a hero, but everybody is today. But these guys stood strong for eternity. And they stood strong for you and for me. Because all of this is about you and me. Remember that. We don't want to forget that this is about keeping what? Pure. The seed line It's about bringing who into the world? The Messiah, Christ. Don't forget that. This just isn't happenstance. This just isn't part of their story. These guys were a part of bringing the Messiah into the world. They didn't understand that. But God put Judah in captivity to teach Judah a lesson, to keep the seed line pure. And this is what it cost these fellows for you and for me. All this is for you and for me. So, let me get back over here into the right column now. Verse 21. Then these men were, we already read that, verse 22. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame slew the men who threw our 3 young men in. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was astounded because he expected them to do what? Just flash right up, right? He expected to see it instantly. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, was it not 3 men we bound into the midst of the fire? And what would their answer have been? Yes. It was, great king. They replied to him. He said, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Who was the 4th man? Jesus? I think it was the Messiah, the angel of the Lord. You know what I mean? It was the Messiah, was walking in there with them. I'd like to have known what they were talking about. You know, it'd be really very interesting. Well, Lord, this isn't as hot as I thought it would be. And the Lord's saying, well, I wonder why. You know, why isn't it as hot? Because he's there. Wherever Jesus is, there's a shield around you. But it may cost you. These men were willing to be thrown in the fire because they refused to worship a false god. Now, Tim, I think you brought it up. Sometimes we're worshiping false gods. Only we don't see it as false gods because we don't have little images maybe sitting in our garage, in our backyard, or somewhere else that we give our lives to. Did you know that you can worship men in the body of Christ? Did you know you can do that? So we need to be very careful who we bow down before and who we hold up. So any comments on this? Anybody got any thoughts about what was saying to them? Yes.
If you think about the power of the fire and how much hotter they got, it kind of reminds you of the Elijah situation, prophets of Baal.
Mm-hmm.
Just in the reverse, because it also shows the power of God versus the foolishness of man. He heated that so hot, like there's no way they're going to survive this. God protect them.
Yeah.
Elijah, on purpose, soaked that entire altar, knowing that the prophets would think, well, there's no way that's going to burn.
It burned. Yeah.
It's God versus man.
Yeah.
God's always going to win.
Pretty amazing, isn't it? Just amazing. Anybody else? Yes.
I like what he said, because he brings out the point that often God takes situations to the extreme to prove he's God, like Elijah and
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's like, you're going to know now.
Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar still didn't become a theist, a theist. He still remained a prophet. But we'll read something here in a minute. Thanks for that. Anybody else? Yes, Matt.
These guys didn't just save themselves by their faith. They saved probably another Holocaust, another Jewish Holocaust that would have been coming, because this is just the leadership coming together first.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, then the word is going to go out, probably a decree to everyone. And then how many Jews would have either said, I'm just going to bow down and lose their soul, or stand and also get thrown in the furnace. Now, they may save their soul doing so,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
what I'm saying is, if you think about the repercussions of their decision, it's another Esther-like story where she went ahead and said, all right, if I'm going to do it and I die, then I die.
Right.
But then it ended up saving all of you.
Right. Thanks a lot. Very important to bring that out. I want you to remember, though, again, that all this happens for who? All for us. This is about bringing the Messiah into the world. This is not just history. I mean, it's history, but it's salvation history. Yes.
Yeah. Whenever I read this, and I didn't think of it myself, I've heard other preachers talk about it. They call it a Christophany, right? When Christ appears outside of the.
Oh, I see what you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
It always gets me thinking, what are the other times?
Yeah.
Some say the burning bush.
Abraham and the three guys and.
What was it with Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah?
Christ's always been involved in our lives, hasn't he? Always. Yeah. Anybody else? You sure you didn't raise your hand? I know I saw you raise your hand. Okay. All right, let's go on and read. I just think it's a great story. A true story. Let's see where I'm at here. Okay. Okay, so he said, look, I see the four men. Verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace. He must have let it burn down just a little bit, right? It doesn't seem to be as hot as it was. Then he came to the door of the furnace of blazing fire, who responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God. Now, I've had some people say, well, he became a theist then. No, he just recognizes Daniel's God as what? The Most High God. And come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. I wonder, did they have smiles on their faces? You know, maybe the Lord would have untied them, and loosed their bindings and so forth. How could you keep from not walking out arrogantly and saying, told you so? Right? What's that? You don't know?
No, I think I'd be more humble coming out of there, especially with you. If there was a fourth person in there.
Well, there was.
Okay, and you're only alive because that other person possibly was there.
Mm-hmm.
I think I wouldn't be coming up too arrogantly. I would be coming very humble and thankful.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Bob.
I agree with what she just said, to be very humble.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't win that, we didn't go in there to win a big victory, we went in there because.
So they wouldn't have come out arrogantly because they went in there serving God, and they would come out serving God.
They could have come out proud for their God, too.
Okay.
I could go either way on that.
Okay.
Yeah, see, this is God.
Yeah.
Isn't he great?
Yeah. Was that the first bell? Okay. All right. Yes.
Before you move on, what's the only thing that was burned?
The three men, the warriors.
They were bound, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else was touched.
Mm-mm.
They came out unbound. The binding was burned.
Okay.
It said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you what?
Make you what?
Truth shall make you what? You shall know
Free.
the truth. Truth shall make you free.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Ephesians 1:18 through 20.
Is that going to be your next sermon for us, please?
We have the same power available to us today through Jesus Christ these three men had in that furnace, if we will submit our lives to God. The only thing burned was the binding that held them. We are free from the bondage of sin through the blood of Jesus today.
Okay. AJ.
And that going on with that is probably pretty well to know that you don't need to say anything. There was no words that were recorded there.
Right.
That was enough to, in our times, mic drop. But
Yeah. You're not going to let me read this last part. Go ahead, Tim.
Some scholars believe that the fiery furnace of Judeo-Christian scripture was in fact Baba Gurgur, a natural gas seep from Kirkuk, Iraq. According to some estimates, the eternal flames of Baba Gurgur have been burning for over 4,000 years and have reached temperatures as high as 3,700 degrees.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else? That's hot, isn't it? That's hot. Anybody else? All right, let's just read how it closes out here. Let's go verse 28. I better put this up. I don't want to Oh, shoot. I wanted to go over. God can choose to let you be persecuted. He did Peter and John, if you remember, in Acts 4 and in Acts 5 and other places in the New Testament. God can choose to do that. You remember Paul saying, I've had all these stripes on me. I've been beaten, all this. And then you go to Hebrews 11, 32 through 40, well, the whole chapter, and you'll see people suffered there for who? For God. So God can choose to allow you to be persecuted for your glory or his glory. His glory. Okay, got through that. All right. Now let's take a look at some of the rest of this here. Let's go on. All right, that should be like 28 through 30. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubble heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. In other words, he didn't say there's only one God. He says, because of what he has seen, did I say that right? Has seen? Because of what he has seen, that no one is to show disrespect towards their God. Because he's seen their God as powerful. Now you remember, often when these polytheistic kings captured a nation, they'd take their gods with them. Because after all, their gods might help them in the future. You know what I mean? So he's not declaring, I'm a theist. But he's declaring that you need to pay attention. Do not speak anything against these three men's God, or you're going to what? Regret it. And they'll remember, well, he threw the three in the furnace. We're not going to speak against their God for a time. So any comments or anything before we close out? Yes, Marvin.
It just kind of cracks me up that he says these things that happen to these people. He's not interested in praising God or giving God glory. He's still putting himself in a position of authority, saying, this is what I'm going to do to hear me.
Yeah. And we're going to see that next. We're going to see his hard-learned lessons, aren't we? Anybody else? Thank you. Okay, let's get ready for worship. Let's have some fellowship. Thank you.